Mara Ellery awoke in the hour before the first bird call, when even the wind seemed reluctant to stir and the frost still clung to windows in thin, uncertain veils. She reached for the wool shawl that lived on the chair beside her bed, wrapping it around her shoulders as if the act might shield her from more than just a morning cold. The floorboards creaked beneath her bare feet, a familiar complaint, their voices as weary as her own. She moved through the narrow corridor of the farmhouse without lighting a lamp, trusting the dim shape of memory over the clumsy glare of flame. Outside, the horizon was still a hush of ash and silver, and the world waited, unspoken and undecided, like a breath held too long. The kitchen was dim and clean, the wood stove's embers sleeping low in the grate. She stirred them gently to life, coaxing flame with practiced patience, watching the flicker catch and build. Her hands were the calluses of repetition, kneading, chopping, gathering, sewing, and though the tasks had shifted a little over the years, the weight behind them had. Once, these mornings had been shared, her body half expectant with a possibility that never arrived. She had imagined a high chair tucked in the corner, imagined little boots muddied by garden soil, imagined the riotous clatter of spoons against tin bowls. But imagination, as she'd come to understand, was a cruel currency when spent on empty rooms. She pulled on her coat and stepped into the yard. The hens stirred softly in their coop, feathers ruffling in the cold, as she scattered feed into the grass. Her breath hung visible in the air, a ghostly trail that vanished before it could settle. The chickens pecked greedily, indifferent to the hunger that stirred more slowly in her chest. Behind her, the old swing swayed slightly from a branch above the garden plot, its rope frayed, its seat faded by sun and memory. She never sat there. She let it move on its own, caught by wind or the restless turn of time. The neighbors said little to her face, but words traveled in the way wind travels through dry grass, hissing, crackling, igniting small fires where they thought she would never hear. The word barren had been used once, softly at first, by a cousin-in-law trying to offer sympathy as though it were a diagnosis she could learn to live beside. Later returned with more bitterness, from the mouths of women with hips wide from birth and hands always full. At the market, she heard it sometimes tucked into phrases like, "What a pity," or "Such a lovely home, too." Remarks stitched with barbs, offered with the polite malice of those who have never tasted deep solitude and feared silence. She had stopped attending the harvest festivals 5 years ago, after the third miscarriage. There had been a time when she tried to participate, to bring pies warm with cinnamon or jars of golden peaches, to stand among the others with her shoulders held square and her smile steady. But grief is a quiet kind of exile, and she found that each attempt to rejoin the fold only deepened the feeling that she was a stranger among her own kind. No one ever asked directly, but their glances betrayed them. They looked for signs, a rounded belly, a swaddled infant, and when they found none, their eyes moved on quickly, like embarrassed guests at a wake. She came to understand that her absence caused less discomfort than her presence, and in time she slipped into the rhythm of solitude with the same diligence she applied to baking or pruning the apple trees. The farmhouse had belonged to her husband's grandfather before it became theirs, and it bore the marks of generations. A dip in the floor near the pantry where children had once run in circles, a faded growth chart still etched in pencil beside the laundry room door, a porch swing that groaned in greeting when the wind was high. After their final loss, Thomas had started spending more time in the fields and less time looking her in the eye. He had not left in anger, but in a quiet resignation that spoke of years stretched thin by grief and the polite pretense that love alone could carry what the body could not. One morning he had packed a single suitcase, kissed her on the forehead as she poured coffee, and said only, "I need a different kind of silence." He never returned, though he wrote once a year, short letters, always signed of kindness but never regret. She did not hate him for leaving. If anything, she understood the instinct too well. There were mornings when even she found the weight of stillness too great to bear. In those hours, she busied her hands, moving from one task to the next until the ache dulled and the silence began to feel like something she had chosen rather than inherited. She baked bread more than she could eat, hung herbs to dry in neat bundles, and mended old linens with small, careful stitches that served no real purpose. Everything she did bore a kind of prayer beneath it, unspoken and invisible, an offering to the life that never came, to the cradle that remained folded in the attic, to the names she had once whispered into the night and never said aloud again. Her favorite time of day was just before the sun lifted itself over the ridge, when the sky was a trembling wash of gray and lavender, and the fields looked as though they were waiting to be remembered. It was then she allowed herself the luxury of stillness, standing at the edge of the back pasture, boots deep in frost-slicked grass. She would tilt her face toward the growing light and imagine the shape of a life unlived. She saw a child's shadow chasing chickens through the yard, heard a voice calling Mama from the orchard, felt small fingers gripping hers as they stepped over stones at the creek's edge. These visions did not come with bitterness anymore. They came gently, like the scent of lilacs in spring, soft and unexpected, lingering just long enough to remind her that absence, too, could hold beauty. That morning, as she carried a pail of eggs back to the kitchen, she paused at the door and looked out across the hills. A low mist curled over the land, clinging to the roots of the trees like a secret. The world was quiet, wrapped in a hush of things not yet begun. She felt the old ache stir in her chest, the one that lived not just in her body but in the worn floorboards, the empty nursery, the meals cooked for one. It was a familiar ache, almost companionable in its constancy. She did not cry. She had not cried in years. The tears had dried up long ago, turned inward, feeding something that grew deep beneath the surface, a quiet resilience shaped like longing. Inside, the kettle hissed to a boil, and she poured water over dried mint leaves, letting the steam fog the window above the sink. She stood there for a long while, one hand resting on the chipped porcelain, watching the light creep across the field like a slow tide. In that moment, her world was small: eggs in a basket, tea in a cup, silence in the rooms, and yet it was everything she had built from the ruins of expectation. She did not know, as she sipped her tea and reached for the loaf she had baked the night before, that everything was about to shift. She could not yet imagine the weight of two small bodies pressed against her chest, the sound of newborn cries at the edge of dawn, the way a single note tucked beneath a blanket could unravel every sorrow she had ever sown into her days. For now, she simply stood in her kitchen, wrapped in shawl and shadow, and waited for morning to finish arriving. The cry came first, sharp, ragged, and out of place in the familiar hush of dawn. Mara Ellery stood in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone lukewarm, when it reached her, threading its way through the window glass and into her bones like a chill. She stiffened, at first unsure she had imagined it, if her mind had conjured sound to fill the aching quiet. But then it came again, quivering and high, a plaintive wail that cut through the stillness like the sudden crack of a breaking branch. She set her cup down with trembling fingers, the clink of porcelain against which strangely loud, and moved toward the front door with measured pace that belied the rush of dread unfurling beneath her skin. Outside, the light had shifted, pale and new, spilling over the frost-covered fields with diffused glow that seemed reluctant to commit to morning. The air was bitter, the cold settling deep into her joints as she stepped onto porch, boots thudding softly against the worn planks. At first, she saw nothing. The yard lay quiet beneath its veil of frost, and the familiar outlines of the coop, the shed, and the old swing cast long, shivering shadows in the half-light. But then there, just beside the doorstep, tucked close to the edge of the porch as though seeking warmth from a house, lay a bundle swaddled in fabric, motionless except for the occasional twitch of movement beneath the folds. Mara's heart lurched violently, and she descended the steps in a near run, falling to her knees before the bundle. The air hitched in her throat as she peeled back the top layer of the quilt, hands clumsy with disbelief, revealing first a tiny fist, curled and pink with cold, and then a face, flushed and wet with tears, mouth open in protest, eyes squeezed tight against the morning light. Her breath caught as she lifted the child into her arms, holding it close, her body moving instinctively into a rhythm of protection and warmth. But then the bundle shifted again, and something else stirred beneath the quilt. With a sound that was almost a gasp, she reached back down and found a second infant nestled against the first, smaller but breathing steadily, their tiny mouth working against the chill air as though searching for comfort it had not yet known. Twins. She looked down at them, her arms now cradling both fragile bodies, and felt something crack wide open inside her, a feeling too large to name, too sudden to contain. The babies were dressed in thin cotton onesies, their feet bare, their faces blotched with cold. The quilt that wrapped them was worn, the stitching frayed in places, smelling faintly of wood smoke and milk, as though it had come from a home not far from here. Nestled beside them, almost missed in the fold of the blanket, was a folded scrap of paper, edges damp and ink smudged. She opened it with care, shielding it from a breeze. Please forgive me. I cannot do this. They deserve more than I can give. I beg whoever finds him to show mercy. Please, asterisk, asterisk. There was no name, no explanation, just a trembling confession of someone who had vanished into the cold before dawn. Mara stared at the words, her lips moving in a silent repetition of them, and felt a shiver run through her, not from the cold but from the sheer weight of what had been left on her doorstep, the staggering, impossible hope wrapped in a stranger sorrow. The babies whimpered against her chest, and she rose, unsteady but certain in movement, and carried them inside. The warmth of the kitchen hit her like a wave as she closed the door with her heel and turned the latch with the same hand that still held the note. She moved quickly, setting the babies down on a foldable blanket atop the kitchen table, hands already reaching for the kettle, for the goat's milk she had strained the evening before. Everything moved through her like muscle memory, guided by instincts long buried but never extinguished. She warmed the milk on the stove, fingers trembling as she measured into old glass bottles she had once tucked away in a box marked someday, a box she had not opened in years. As the bottles warmed, she touched the infant's cheeks, testing the coldness of their skin, murmuring nonsense words into the soft down of their hair. She wrapped them in towels and blankets pulled from the linen cupboard, tucked heated stones wrapped in cloth beside them, and rocked them gently even as her mind spun with questions she did not yet know how to form. Who had left them? Where had they come from? How long had they waited outside before she heard them cry? She pictured them lying in the dark, the frost gathering around them, their small hearts beating beneath the silence, waiting for someone to come. The thought struck her with such force that her knees nearly buckled, and she caught herself on the edge of the table, fighting back the tide of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. When the milk was ready, she tested its warmth against her wrist, the same way her mother had once shown her, and fed each baby in turn. The smaller ones suckled weakly at first, but then with more strength, their tiny fingers gripping the edge of the bottle. Mara watched them drink, her own breath coming in shallow gasps, the weight of the moment settling into her chest like a stone. She had fed lambs like this in the spring, orphan creatures with soft hooves and glassy eyes, but never had she held human life this close, so newly arrived, so vulnerable, and so wholly dependent on the strength of her hands. The minutes passed unnoticed as she fed and burped them, wrapped them tighter in clean linens, and held them against her chest, rocking slowly in the chair by the stove. The house, so often filled only with the sound of ticking clocks and wind at the eaves, now pulsed with breath and heartbeat and the soft, rhythmic noises of new life. She did not know what to make of it. Not yet. The questions, legal, ethical, practical, crowded in at the edges of her thoughts, but she held them at bay with the sheer force of presence. For now, they were here. For now, they were safe. For now, she was not alone. The light outside brightened into true morning, the mist lifting slowly from the hills, and Mara sat unmoving, one baby in each arm, her eyes tracing the curve of their cheeks, the barely their lashes define, trembling rise and fall of their chests. There was no clarity, no sudden understanding, only a quiet hum beneath her skin, something old and sacred that had nothing to do with plans or papers or permission. She thought of the cradle in the attic, long wrapped in canvas and buried beneath boxes of her mother's things. She thought of the tiny garments she had sewn years ago and never had the courage to give away. She thought of the room with the faded robin wallpaper and how she had never been able to repaint it, even when logic urged her to let go. She did not move from the chair until both babies were asleep, their bodies limp with the full surrender of the newly comforted. She looked down at them and felt her eyes sting, her throat tighten, her breath become a fragile, trembling thing. The ache in her chest was no longer the dull throb of longing. It was sharp now, urgent, and laced with a kind of terror she had not expected. It would be easier, she knew, to call someone, to pass them along to a system built for such things, to keep her life intact, unshaken, untouched. But even as the thought crossed her mind, She knew it was a lie. Nothing was intact now. Something had broken open, and from that break something was pouring in, wild, radiant, overwhelming. She pressed her lips to their foreheads, first one and then the other, and closed her eyes. The fire in the stove cracked softly behind her, and outside, the wind swept over the fields, carrying with it the distant promise of thaw. Morning had arrived, and with it, two lives she had not expected and could not turn away. Whatever the hours ahead might bring, Mara Ellery understood this one thing with absolute clarity. The children had been left to her, not by fate or faith or accident, but by the trembling, desperate hands of someone who had trusted a stranger's porch more than their own path. And in that trust, however broken, lay something sacred. Something she could not and would not ignore. The house felt different by mid-morning. Not simply because it was filled now with the sounds of small, needy lives, but because Mara Ellery herself had changed in a way she could not yet name. It was not dramatic or sudden, no lightning-struck epiphany, but rather the slow, reverent unfolding of something that had been dormant in her for years. The twins had fallen asleep in the basket she had lined hastily with flannel cloth and the softest of her old scarves, their mouths twitching now and again as if still nursing in dreams. She moved through the house with quiet care, gathering what little she had that could serve the children. Old towels, folded muslin cloths, a stack of disused cotton napkins that could now serve as swaddles. In her sewing room, dusty with disuse, she pulled open drawers and retrieved the baby clothes she had once made, never worn, folded and refolded so many times that the creases seemed part of the fabric's weave. She had never been able to part with them, even when Thomas had gently suggested they donate the box to a church drive in town. There had been no sharp words between them. There rarely were. But she remembered the look in his eyes, weary and quietly pleading, as if to say, "Please, let me move forward if you cannot." She hadn't answered him then, only shaken her head, clutching the box against her chest as if it contained not clothes but something vital, something breathing. She had placed it back on the top shelf of the cupboard, and there it had remained, untouched until now. The memory of that morning haunted her as she unfolded the tiny shirts, smoothing their embroidered seams with trembling fingers. She could not help but marvel at the strange alchemy of grief and preparation that had driven her to make them in the first place, a hope stitched into each hem, each buttonhole. That hope had long since withered, but now, in the low light of this new day, it stirred again like a buried root waking to spring. She laid the garments beside the sleeping twins, watching as a shaft of light from the kitchen window fell across their faces. The boy was larger by an inch or two, the planes of his cheeks rounder, his mouth soft in rest. The girl was smaller, her features more finely drawn, her breasts more delicate and spaced apart, as if she had been born with the caution of someone already acquainted with absence. Mara sat between them on the wooden bench, her knees touching the edge of the table, her hands folded in her lap, feeling the echo of an old, forgotten silence begin to dissolve. By noon, the reality of the situation pressed him more fully. She could not simply keep them without question. A part of her understood this clearly. Even at the thought of letting them go ignited a panic in her chest that left her breathless. She had not even named them, unwilling yet to lay claim to what might be taken from her. She told herself she needed help. Not help to mother them, for that felt already within her, but help to ensure they were well, safe, examined, known. She considered the town midwife, Clara Loden, whose eyes were sharp but whose hands were always steady. Clara had attended most of the births in the region for the last 2 decades, including Mara's first, when the child had not drawn breath, and Clara had wrapped the tiny, silent form in linen and said nothing except, "You can hold her as long as you need." It had been a kindness Mara never forgot. She took the telephone from its cradle on the wall, the rotary dial sticking slightly from years of disuse, and turned Clara's number into the receiver. Her voice, when Clara answered, sounded foreign in her own mouth, husky, unsteady, as if not used to conversation anymore. She explained in halting phrases that 2 babies had been left at her door, that they were alive and fed and warm, but that she needed someone who knew what signs to look for, someone who would not turn this into a spectacle before she even understood what she had been asked to hold. There was a pause, then Clara's voice, calm and low, "I'll be there in 20 minutes." True to her word, Clara arrived bundled in a wool coat, her kid in one hand, her gaze sharp as ever. She said nothing as Mara led her into the kitchen, only nodded once at the sight of the twins. She washed her hands at the sink, unwrapped her tools, and knelt beside the table, examining each infant in turn with the quiet intensity of someone who had learned to listen before she spoke. She weighed them with her hands, took their temperatures, opened their mouths to check for palate deformities, and inspected their fingers and toes with clinical tenderness. When she finished, she wrapped them again and sat back on her heels. "They're healthy," she said, smoothing her apron. "Thin, but not dangerously so. No signs of abuse or trauma. They were left carefully. Somebody wanted them to live." She met Mara's eyes then, the weight of her gaze like stone. "This is going to get complicated." Mara nodded slowly. "I know," she whispered. Clara didn't press her, only asked if she had seen anyone that morning. Footprints, a cart, anything unusual, but there had been nothing. The frost had melted too quickly under the growing sun. Whoever had brought them had done so in darkness, and with care, as if determined to leave no trace behind. Clara stood, wiped her hands, and said she would inform the constable, but discreetly. She wouldn't tell the village yet. She knew what tongues could do, and how fast they moved when something didn't fit inside the neat lines of expectation. Before leaving, she placed a hand on Mara's shoulder. "You want to keep them, don't you?" It wasn't really a question. Mara didn't answer, because the answer was already written across her face. When the door closed behind Clara, Mara exhaled slowly, pressing her forehead to the cool glass of the window panes. Outside, the wind had picked up, stirring the bare branches of the apple trees. She stood that way for a long time, absorbing the enormity of what she had just stepped into, knowing that nothing would be the same, not tomorrow, not the day after. When she turned back toward the table, the babies had stirred, the girl beginning to fuss, the boy blinking into wakefulness. She moved to them, whispering as she lifted them into her arms, and for the first time, she called them by names, not because she had chosen them, but because they seemed to rise from some hidden place inside her. She named the boy Elias, after her grandfather who had taught her to mend fences and sing hymns off-key under the summer stars. She named the girl Ruth for the woman in Scripture who had once said, "Where you go, I will go," and meant it as she spoke their names aloud. Something shifted in the air around her, as if the house itself had taken a breath. That night, she did not sleep. She sat beside the stove while Elias and Ruth slept curled against her chest, one on each side. She sang softly to them, her voice cracked with rust but warm, songs she thought she had forgotten. The old lullabies her mother used to hum while washing dishes. The field songs her grandmother once whispered while brushing Mara's hair. These songs had not touched the air in years, but they came back now with astonishing ease, as if they had waited in the walls, in the cracks of floor and the threads of her clothing. As she sang, she remembered how the heart can hold more than grief, how it can expand like cloth under a seamstress's needle, shaped again into something strong enough to carry love. At some point in the night, as the fire burned low and the snow began to fall lightly outside, Mara felt her fear ease its grip. The world beyond her door would have it say soon enough, laws, judgments, procedures, paperwork. But here, in this quiet space, the only thing that mattered was that two children were warm, breathing, and no longer alone. She did not know what she was stepping into, but she knew what she would not do. She would not abandon them. She would not surrender them to cold corridors and temporary care. She would fight, not with defiance or noise, but with the steady, unyielding strength of someone who had already survived the empty years and could no longer bear to watch another life unravel for lack of being held. And so, before dawn touched the frost-laced windows, she stood in the nursery, lighting the oil lamp that had sat unused for nearly a decade. She opened the wardrobe, removed the canvas-draped cradle, and began to dust and clean and prepare. She changed the sheets, tucked in a hand-stitched blanket, and placed Ruth and Elias down together. Then she sat beside them and waited, not for permission, not for approval, but for the rising of the sun on a day that would begin and end with her choosing to love what had been left behind. The first snowstorm arrived in the night, silent and ruthless, blanketing the valley in a depth of white so thick that by morning the fences along Mara Ellery's pasture had vanished beneath it, and the wind carved soft edges into every shape it touched. The road to the village disappeared before sunrise, and the telephone line sagged under a weight of ice that rendered it lifeless by noon. Inside the house, the fire burned low, and Mara moved quickly, her body sharp with a sense of urgency that had long slept beneath the surface of her quiet days. The twins were swaddled and warm, tucked into the cradle beside the stove where the heat was strongest, their cheeks flushed with sleep and the shallow, rhythmic breath of infants still learning the world by scent and sound. She kept checking on them, touching their foreheads, adjusting their blankets, whispering their names into the hush of the kitchen like talismans against the wind's howl. Outside, the trees groaned beneath the weight of snow, their limbs bending like penitent figures in prayer. Mara watched them from the window as she boiled water on the stove and soaked oats for the goats, who had grown restless in their shelter and stomped their hooves in protest. The hen house was already buried past the door, but she would have to dig out before dusk. Every chore now demanded twice the labor, and yet she found herself moving through the tasks with a steadiness that surprised her. There was no time to falter. Not anymore. Where once she might have let the cold stall her, might have curled back beneath blankets and let the silence carry her through another day, now every hour required her hands, her watchfulness, her presence. The woodpile was a dwindling worry. She had split a season's worth in September, stacking it neatly beneath the porch. But storms like this could stretch for days, and the drift were already swallowing the edges of her supply. She carried armfuls inside each time she went out, her gloves stiff with frost, her breath forming clouds before her. The twins remained her constant thought even when she was outdoors. Would the house stay warm enough through the night? Was the milk still hot enough when she fed them? Could the storm shake the roof? She found herself checking the rafters, her eyes scanning for leaks, for cracks, for anything that might break beneath pressure. She had become, overnight, the sentinel of a fortress she hadn't known she'd been preparing. Inside, every room held a new rhythm now. The hours bent themselves around feedings, changing lullabies, and short, staggering naps. She marked time not by clocks, but by the cries of waking hunger, the soft sighs of sleep, the moments when her eyes, still unfocused, still uncertain, seemed to find hers with a kind of fragile trust that broke her open each time. She sang to them more often now, lullabies that came from the recesses of her memory, old hymns her mother once sang while hanging sheets to dry, half-remembered folk tunes passed down through breath and repetition. Her voice wavered at first, but the more she sang, the more it steadied, and something in her seemed to steady with it. Elias was the louder of the two, his cry full-throated and insistent, a declaration of need that left no room for misunderstanding. Ruth, on the other hand, rarely cried outright. She whimpered, her mouth trembling before sound emerged, her needs communicated in soft complaints and long, pleading glances. Mara responded to them both in kind, learning their languages day by day. The pitch of Elias' hunger versus his discomfort, the subtle shift in Ruth's breathing that meant she was waking, the way their bodies curled differently when they were cold or when they simply wanted to wear her arms around them. She kept them close always. Even when they slept, she carried the cradle from room to room, so they would never wake to silence. She did not want them to learn aloneness too early, not after being abandoned so young. It was not a thought she allowed herself to linger on for long. The image of them left on her porch, the fear that must have settled into their tiny limbs, the cold that might have claimed them if she had not heard their cries in time. But the image returned anyway, most often in quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the snow pressed thick against the windows and the fire dimmed and Mara sat awake while the twins slept. She would hold one or the other against her chest, feeling the small rise and fall of their breathing, and think of the mother, whoever she was, who had left them behind. Had she watched from the trees, waited until the light flickered on in the window? Had she hesitated, wept, whispered their names into the wind before letting them go? Mara tried not to resent her. It would be easy to hate, to curse the woman's cowardice or cruelty, but the truth was far murkier than that. Mercy and desperation often wore the same face. As the days of the storm wore on, the house became both sanctuary and prison. Mara had not ventured farther than the chicken coop in 3 days. The snow continued to fall with grim persistence, and though she rationed firewood carefully, the chill began to seep into far corners of the house. She closed off the parlor and the sewing room, confining their world to the kitchen, nursery, and her own bedroom. where she could heat the space more efficiently. She cooked simple meals, oat cakes, boiled root vegetables, broth from the bones of last season's hens. She ate standing more often than not, rocking the baby against her hip, her free hand stirring a pot or pouring water. Hunger no longer came to her in sharp pangs, but in slow recognition, like a bell tolling from a distant hill. She fed herself because she must, not because she wanted to. All her desire now poured outward. Sleep was a luxury meted out in fragments. Mara learned to doze in a rocking chair, to wake at the rustle of linens, to quiet them before their cries could rise and echo. She did not mind the fatigue. It felt earned, purposeful. Unlike the bone-deep weariness she had known in the years after Thomas left, this was a new exhaustion, one laced with movement and meaning. She had felt invisible for so long, no longer wife, never mother, merely a woman passing through the days like a shadow on the wall. But now, with every diaper changed, every bottle warmed, she felt herself re-emerging, not as she had once been, but as someone newly forged. There were moments, of course, when fear surged through her with a power she could barely contain. What if someone came? What if the state found out? What if the twins were taken from her and placed in some sterile home filled with strangers and rules? The law did not favor quiet gestures. It demanded documentation, blood ties, declarations signed and witnessed. Mara had none of these. Only a house full of warmth and a heart fuller still. Some nights, she imagined a knock at the door, the men in suits with grim eyes and clipboards, and she would curl tighter around the babies, as if her arms alone could bar the world from reaching them. On the fourth day, the snow stopped. The clouds parted slowly, reluctant in their retreat, and the late afternoon sun spilled gold across the drifts. The road remained impassable, but Mara stepped out into the yard with Elias in a sling against her chest, Ruth still sleeping in the cradle by the stove. The cold bit at her cheeks, but the silence of the landscape was beautiful, undisturbed, unbroken, like a painting of the life she had once dreamed. She walked to the gate and back, testing the snow beneath her boots, and then stood for a long time at the edge of the field, Elias' breath warming the hollow of her throat. In that stillness, she made a vow, not aloud, not in grand words, but in the marrow of her bones. Whatever came next, whatever questions or accusations or reckonings awaited, she would not abandon these children. She had lived too long inside absence to surrender now to fear. The storm had come and passed, and her house had held. Her hands had held. Her heart, once emptied and sealed shut, had held. That night, she lit every oil lamp in the kitchen. She bathed the twins in warmed water, humming softly as she cupped their heads and whispered their names like a prayer. She dressed them in the clothes she had sewn years ago, slightly large, but soft and warm, and watched as they blinked up at her, their eyes bright with the simple grace of survival. Then she sat with them beneath the lamplight, rocking slowly as the fire crackled low. The snow glowed silver against the window panes, and the world outside, for once, did not press him with grief or judgment, but merely stood still and quiet and wide open. The nursery had long been a room shut against memory, a space where silence had gathered in the corners like dust and lingered even when the windows were open for spring cleaning. After the third loss, Mara Ellery had closed the door without ceremony, turning the knob with steady hands and locking the quiet inside. She had not entered again in nearly 8 years. At first, the gesture had been one of self-preservation, a way to mark the end of waiting, to cordon off the part of her that had once allowed herself to dream. Later, it became habit and then simply history. The door was just a door. The room behind it was simply space and used. But now, with Ruth and Elias sleeping on her chest in the waning light of early March, their small bodies curled into the curve of her shoulders like the final piece of something long unfinished, she knew she could no longer pretend the room did not matter. She opened for the first time just after sunset, when the house was still warm from the day's fire and the twins had been fed and wrapped in blankets that smelled of lavender and soap. The door creaked as it swung inward, protesting the sudden shift from stillness to presence, as though the very air inside had thickened with waiting. The scent was faint, but familiar, old wood, linen, and the dry perfume of wallpaper that had not been touched in years. The robins were still there, printed in flight across the faded blue paper, their wings outstretched in a pattern that had once seemed so full of hope. She had chosen the design herself, years ago, believing the birds would give the room a sense of motion, of life. It was meant to be a place where a child could grow among symbols of freedom and gentle wonder. Now, in the flickering glow of her lamp, the birds seemed more like ghosts, paused forever mid-flight, caught in a sky that had never opened. Mara stepped inside slowly, as if entering sacred ground. Dust motes danced in the narrow beam of her light. The cradle, made of cherry wood and carved by her father before his stroke, sat beneath the window, untouched. The quilt draped over it was one her mother had sewn before her death, a pattern of stars and wind-blown leaves stitched in careful lines. She had meant for her first daughter to sleep beneath it, a thought that had haunted Mara each time she folded it tighter, pressing the fabric into corners so it wouldn't remind her of what had never come. The changing table, the bookshelf, the small rocking horse Thomas had found at a market and painted white. All still stood, their colors dulled by time, their purpose suspended in air. She ran her fingers along the top of the dresser, where once she had placed baskets of lotions, powders, and cloths, each selected with a care that now seemed both reverent and foolish. She remembered the hours she had spent in that room before the miscarriages, folding and refolding clothes, lining up tiny socks in perfect pairs, organizing the books in order of subject and softness. She had memorized the creak in the floor near the crib, the way the light fell across the wall at noon, the exact smell of the drawer that held muslin cloths and hand-knitted hats. Each detail had been a promise, and each promise had gone unanswered. She sat on the floor and wept, not with the sharp violence of grief newly born, but with the slow, deliberate ache of something long withheld. Her tears soaked into her skirt and then into the wood beneath her, as if the room itself had been waiting to absorb them. It was not sorrow for what she had lost that broke her, but the realization that she had kept the loss so carefully, so faithfully, as if honoring it might make it sacred. She had preserved the room like a shrine, not out of devotion, but because she did not know what else to do with so much silence. When she finally stood, her knees stiff and her breath uneven, she did not close the door again. She kept it open and returned with cloth and a basin of warm water. Slowly, she began to clean. She wiped down the crib, smoothed the quilt, polished the knobs of the dresser until a reflection appeared in their brass surfaces. She took the linens to the washroom and rinsed them by hand, soaking them in lavender oil and sunlight. She dusted the shelves and placed fresh books upon them. Some old fairy tales, some picture books, a few worn poetry collections from her own childhood. She opened the windows during the warmer hours of the day, letting the spring air breathe new life into the wallpaper, letting the wind speak through the curtains like an invitation. Each day she worked. Ruth and Elias watched from their new cradle in the doorway, their eyes following her movements, their small bodies curling into one another like twin roots growing toward the same warmth. Mara spoke to them as she cleaned. She told them stories, not of sorrow, but of beginnings. She told them about the birds on the wall, about the songs she used to sing to the empty crib, about the way the room had once waited with her, and how it had never stopped waiting. She did not try to hide her sadness. She let live beside her joy, not as an enemy, but as something necessary, like shadow to light. There was no ceremony when the nursery was finally ready, no declaration. She simply picked up Ruth one afternoon, pressed her lips to the child's warm cheek, and carried her into the room. She laid her in the cradle that had waited so long and watched as her daughter, hers now, in all the ways that mattered, blinked slowly at the ceiling, then turned her head toward the robin-covered wall, as if she had been born knowing this place. She fetched Elias next and did the same, and when he reached out in sleep and grasped his sister's hand, Mara felt something in her release, a tightness she had not even known she'd been holding. The room, once ghostly with absence, was now filled with breath, with warmth, with a soft rustle of new life settling into its rightful space. She kept the chair by the window, and each morning she sat there with her tea, the cradle beside her, the sun painting gold across the floorboards. She watched the robins on the wallpaper and the robins on the branch outside the window, and let herself believe that perhaps they had always been waiting for this moment, these children, this improbable beginning. She began to hang drawings on the walls, first her own, simple sketches of trees, of rivers, of wildflowers, and then later the twins when they were old enough to hold crayons in their unsteady fists. She taught them to point to the birds and say their names. She hung a bell by the door so they could ring it when they woke from their naps. The ghost did not vanish entirely. Some days she still walked into the nursery and saw the empty space where her first child might have stood, the quiet corner where a rocking chair had once waited for lullabies never sung. But now, those memories did not swallow her. They did not take the air from the room. They simply lived beside her, softer than before, less bitter. Grief, she had come to understand, did not need to be erased. It needed to be carried, gently and without shame, until it could find its own place among the living. One evening, long after the thaw had begun and the fields outside were green with the first signs of planting season, Mara stood in the nursery doorway with both children in her arms. The light was long and amber, slanting across the robins and the bookshelf and the wooden floor like a blessing. Ruth yawned and tucked her head beneath Mara's chin. Elias squirmed, trying to grab a bit of her hair in his fist. She whispered their names again, feeling the weight of them in her mouth. The miracle of syllables spoken not in mourning, but in love. She did not know what the future would demand of her, what claims the world might try to lay on these children, or what lines she would be forced to cross to keep them safe. But she knew, as surely as she had ever known anything, that the room had not been wasted. The years of silence had not been in vain. They had been waiting, as she had been waiting, for the moment the story would begin again, not with erasure, not with forgetting, but with the quiet courage of opening a door that had stayed closed too long. She would tell them, when they were older, not everything, but enough. She would tell them that love is not always born in the places we expect, and that sometimes the rooms we fear returning toward the very ones where healing waits. By midsummer, the land had shifted into a riot of green, and the valley surrounding Mara Ellery's farmhouse breathed with abundance. The apple trees had begun to swell with fruit, their branches heavy with the slow promise of ripening, and the fields that had once lain dormant beneath blankets of snow now rustled with tall grass and murmuring bees. The days were longer, stretching like silken thread between dawn and dusk, and the warmth that filtered through the windows seemed to settle deep into the bones of the house. Ruth and Elias had grown in the span of weeks with a miraculous speed that only infants knew, arms rounding with softness, eyes sharpening, coos turning to babble that spilled from their mouths like the beginnings of speech. Mara moved through her days with rhythm shaped by their needs, her body adjusting to the quiet labor of motherhood, her spirit tethered to small, flickering joys that came without warning. A sudden laugh, a hand clasping hers with unmeasured trust, the weight of two warm bodies sleeping against her. But just as the earth turned on its hidden axis, quietly and without consent, so too did the stillness of Mara's new life begin to shift. The first sign came not from a voice or a visitor, but from a subtle change in the air, an intuition honed by years of solitude. The same instinct that once told her when a goat was about to birth or a storm was settling over the hills. Something unseen pressed against the edges of her peace, and though it had no name, it stirred her at night, kept her standing longer at the windows, listening for footsteps that did not come. She told herself it was nothing, that fear was an echo left behind by the winter she had weathered, by the old grief that had taken root in her spine. But when she went to town for supplies, it was there, waiting not in words, but in the silence that trailed behind her as she passed. The grocer, Mr. Hanley, who had once been brusque but cordial, avoided her eyes as he weighed her potatoes. The woman behind her in line, Mrs. Calvert, lowered her voice to a whisper that stopped the moment Mara turned. Children stared. Their mothers turned them away. It was not outright cruelty, not yet, but the air had thickened with the scent of judgment, faint and sour, like milk on the edge of spoiling. She heard her name spoken once, near the door of the bakery, caught only in fragments, took them in without, not even hers, no kin, not proper. The words dropped like stones into her chest, where they settled and pressed. She returned home with her jaw tight, her shoulders aching. That night, after the twins had fallen asleep, she sat by the fire with the lamp turned low and reread the note left with them, creased and smudged now from her many readings, but still legible in its desperation. Asterisk, please forgive me. I cannot do this. They deserve more than I can give. I beg whoever finds them to show mercy. Please. Asterisk, there had been no name, no detail, no attempt at false story. Just the weight of surrender. Mercy. That was the word Mara returned to over and over. What she had done was not theft, not concealment. It was mercy. And yet mercy, it seemed, did not fit within the ledgers and expectations of a village that had always measured worth by lineage and law. 2 weeks later, the knock came. It was just past noon, and the sky had turned silver with the coming of rain. The twins were napping, their breath a quiet rhythm in the nursery, and Mara was chopping onions in the kitchen, her hands moving in soft, practiced motions. The sound of the knock, a deliberate hollow echo against the oak of the front door, froze her mid-motion. She stood for a moment, the knife still in her hand, her breath caught. When she answered it, 2 figures stood beneath the eaves. One was Clara Loden, her face lined with apology, her eyes shadowed by the weight of something she didn't want to carry. The other was a man in a gray overcoat, his hat pulled low, his expression unreadable. He introduced himself as Mr. Thorne, a representative of the District Child Welfare Board. His tone was clipped, professional, almost weary. "We've had a report," he said without stepping inside, "concerning 2 abandoned infants found on private property." Clara didn't speak, but her eyes were full of unspoken things. Mara felt her hands tighten around the doorknob. She did not invite them in. She stood firm in the doorway and asked, quietly, what report, what concern, what exactly was being questioned. Mr. Thorne opened a folder and read from a piece of paper that seemed far too thin to contain so much consequence. He said that questions had been raised about the legality of her guardianship, that a search for the birth parents had begun, that until their identities could be confirmed or their rights legally relinquished, the children's placement would need to be reviewed. Reviewed. The word was antiseptic, cold. It disguised its threat in civility. "I found them on my porch," Mara said, her voice even. "They were half frozen and crying. No one has come for them. I cared for them because no one else did." Thorne nodded, as if this were beside the point. "It may be temporary," he said, "but they'll need to be placed in the appropriate care until the legal situation is resolved." Mara felt something crack deep in her chest, but her face did not change. "And where is that care be found?" she asked. "With strangers who weren't there when they were screaming in the night? Who didn't hold them through fevers and rocking until morning? They'll be placed in a facility equipped for emergency foster cases," Thorne replied, "with professionals trained for these situations." Mara did not raise her voice. She did not weep. She stood silent for a long moment, the sound of the rain beginning to drum against the roof above them. Then, very simply, she closed the door. Not violently, not with anger, just quietly, with the finality of someone who had already lost too much to let go easily again. They did not knock again that day. Clara returned later, alone, soaked through and pale, her voice low and shaking. "They'll come back," she said. "You have to prepare yourself. There's paperwork now, procedures. A petition's been filed by someone." "Who?" Mara asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Clara hesitated, then said a name she did not recognize. Siblings of the mother, maybe, or a family trying to adopt. But there was something in her voice that made Mara wonder if even Clara believed it. That night, Mara did not sleep. She held Elias while Ruth slept curled on her chest, her arms aching from their weight, her heart aching from the weight of everything else. The wind moved through the trees outside, whispering threats in a language she could almost understand. She thought of leaving, packing the twins in the cart, taking the back road over the hills, finding some distant town where no one knew their names. But she knew such thoughts were foolish. She was not young, and the world had grown smaller. There were files now, registries, people who could track and trace. And besides, she would not raise them in fear. She had promised them mercy. That meant standing still. That meant being seen. So she began to write. Late into the night, she penned a letter by oil lamplight, a testimony, not to the courts, not to the village, but to the children themselves. She told them who they were to her, how they had come to her not as burdens, but as gifts, how the silence of her home had been broken by their cries and remade into something sacred. She described the first time they gripped her finger, the first smile, the first time she felt the ache of motherhood not as a wound, but as a vow. She folded the letter and placed it in a box beneath the nursery cradle, beside the note that had arrived with them, Beside a lock of hair she had clipped from each of their heads a day, they turned 3 months old. The coming days would bring questions, papers, decisions made in offices far from the fields where they had grown. But Mara knew, as surely as she had ever known anything, that no court could measure the depth of her love. No social worker could quantify the night spent walking the floor. No judge could weigh the value of arms that had cradled abandoned lives back into belonging. The apple trees bloomed that week, blossoms falling like pale snow against the grass. And each morning, before the officials returned, before her name was once again weighed against rules she had never been asked to write, Mara stood beneath those trees with Ruth in one arm, Elias in the other, and whispered to them, as the wind carried petals around their feet, that love was not always recognized, but that it was real and that it would hold. The courthouse was not a place Mara Ellery had ever imagined herself entering, not for any reason that mattered. Certainly not with the trembling weight of 2 children's futures pressed like stones against her ribs. It stood at the edge of the village square, a squat stone building with ivy creeping up the southern wall and windows clouded by decades of cold dust and rain. The path that led to it was uneven, the stones worn smooth by the long tread of boots and judgment. Mara had passed it 1,000 times on her way to the market or the post office, always feeling vaguely out of place even when she had nothing to fear. It had never been a building for people like her. Quiet, unseen, content to work the land and let the world pass by. It was for disputes over property, for the drawing of lines between names and lands, for things decided in black ink and low voices, far removed from the tenderness of what had unfolded inside her home. She arrived early, walking the dirt road into town with Ruth in her left arm and Elias in her right, their faces tucked into folds of her shawl, their breath warming her neck. Clara met her at the edge of the square, hands folded, expression unreadable. She had helped where she could, had spoken to the officials, written a letter of support. But Mara could see the lines of worry on her face, could see that even her quiet ally held doubts about how the day would unfold. They entered together, stepping through the heavy wooden doors and into the cool hush of the interior. The room smelled faintly of old paper, floor wax, and time. A row of benches flanked the walls. At the far end stood the magistrate's bench, simple, elevated, and draped with a single worn banner bearing the county seal. There were others present, faces Mara recognized only vaguely, women from the village who had once offered polite nods and now watched her with narrowed eyes, a man with slick back hair and a folder under his arm who introduced himself as Mr. Callahan, legal counsel for petitioners. Beside him stood a couple she had never seen before, well-dressed, composed, the woman with blonde hair wound into a precise braid, the man with a trim beard and a face carved from restraint. They nodded at her, the kind of nod that suggested civility, not kindness. The hearing began without ceremony. The magistrate, a thin man in his early 60s named Harlan Mears, adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and read aloud the nature of proceedings. This is a preliminary custody hearing concerning 2 unidentified minors, infants found abandoned on private property on the morning of January 3rd of this year. The petitioner, represented by legal counsel, is seeking legal guardianship based on familial proximity and the express intent to adopt. He paused. The respondent, Ms. Mara Ellery, asserts de facto custody based on care provided since the children's discovery. The words felt dry, clinical, as if they described objects instead of lives. Mara held Ruth and Elias a little tighter and waited for her moment to be heard. Mr. Callahan spoke first. He presented documents, affidavits, references to state law. He explained that the couple beside him, Martin and Lillian Hargrove, were relatives of the biological mother, second cousins on the maternal side, and that upon learning of the infant's existence, they had acted swiftly to secure their legal right to bring them into their home. He spoke of stability, of education, of access to health care and resources that, as he put it, a single woman of limited means could not be reasonably expected to provide. His tone was not cruel, but it was sharp, shaped with the practiced cadence of someone who believed in order above empathy. He acknowledged briefly that Mara had cared for the children for some months, but argued that such arrangements, while well-intentioned, did not supersede blood, nor did they constitute a lawful transfer of custody. Mara listened in silence, her gaze fixed not on him, but on the magistrate, who scribbled notes with methodical calm. When asked if she had anything to say, She rose, adjusted the shawl over the children, and stepped to the front of the room. She did not read from paper. She had not prepared a speech. She spoke plainly, as one speaks when the heart has no room for performance. "I found them on my porch in the dark of winter," she said, wrapped in an old quilt. No name, no mark, just a note asking for mercy. She paused. "I didn't think. I didn't ask what it would cost me. I only brought them inside. They were hungry. They were cold. I warmed milk on the stove and fed them with my own hands. I stayed awake through the nights. I held them through fevers. I sang to them because they had no one else." Her voice faltered, but she did not stop. "I know what they weigh. I know which one cries in their sleep. I know that Ruth's left eye opens first when she wakes, and that Elias likes to be held facing out so he can see the trees through the window. I didn't give birth to them. I didn't sign any paper, but I have loved them every day since they arrived, and I don't need a law to tell me that love has value." The room was quiet when she finished. The magistrate nodded slowly, lips pursed, and asked if there were any witnesses to speak on her behalf. Clara stepped forward, as did Reverend Hanley, whose wife had once whispered about Mara in the marketplace, but who now looked sheepish and earnest. He spoke of character, of generosity, of the quiet devotion he had observed without ever being asked. Clara spoke of health, of how the twins had grown strong, how Mara had never once asked for help, but had never turned away when it mattered. The Hargroves were given their chance to speak. Lillian's voice trembled slightly as she described their desire to start a family, their belief that it was their duty to step in once they knew the children existed. She said all the right things: love, stability, opportunity. But something in her voice felt rehearsed, as if the words had been studied, not lived. Martin spoke less, offering facts instead of feeling. And though their case was neat on paper, Mara could see that they looked at the children as if they were promises, not people. The magistrate asked for a brief recess to review the documentation. Mara sat with the children on a bench in the corner, her hands shaking only slightly now, her heart bruised but steady. She did not know what the law would say. She only knew what the twins' bodies had taught her in sleep, in hunger, in the way they reached for her without thought. When court reconvened, Magistrate Mears removed his glasses and folded his hands. His voice was even, without flourish. "This is not a final ruling," he said, "but I have reviewed the circumstances of this case and considered the best interests of the children, which must guide us above all else. While the petitioners have a lawful claim and the resources to provide, it is also clear that these children have formed a significant bond with the respondent, who has cared for them through crucial months of early development." He paused, then continued. "Pending a further investigation, I am granting temporary custody to Ms. Ellery, contingent upon continued oversight and a formal inquiry into the status of the birth parents. A final determination will be made after these steps have been completed." Mara closed her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. It was not a victory. It was not certainty. But it was time. And time was what she needed to show the world what her heart already knew. The Hargroves did not speak to her as they left. Clara squeezed her shoulder. Outside, the sky had begun to darken, rain held at bay by clouds too tired to weep. Mara walked home slowly, the twins nestled against her chest, their weight a familiar ache. She knew this was only the beginning of another kind of fight, one that would require not just love, but patience, endurance, and faith in things unseen. But she also knew this. In that courthouse of dust and parchment, her voice had been heard, her truth had not been erased, and for the first time in years, she had stood fully in her life, not waiting, not surviving, but claiming. And the children, still too small to understand the moment they had survived, cooed gently in their sleep, as if the sound of her heartbeat beneath them was proof enough for now that they were home. The days that followed the courthouse hearing were quiet, but not with the peaceful hush that Mara Ellery once knew. This was a waiting kind of silence, taut with questions that hung in the air like rain that would not fall. Though the magistrate had granted her temporary custody, the word temporary echoed in every room of the house, stretching its shadow across the crib where Ruth and Elias slept and threading itself into the rhythm of Mara's days. She rose each morning with a fresh edge of vigilance, listening for the sound of tires on gravel, of someone come to re-examine what she had already lived through and proven. She had won a reprieve, not a homecoming. And though she smiled at the twins and sang as she prepared their meals, something inside her remained braced. Shoulders always slightly drawn, heart always half in retreat. In the village, things shifted with a subtlety that only years of isolation had taught Mara how to read. The gossip did not cease, but it grew less pointed. Where once there had been coldness or blatant avoidance, there was now something more hesitant. A kind of cautious curiosity that crept into glances and short, measured greetings at the market. Some nodded when they passed her, though few stopped to speak. The story of the hearing had made its way through town in bits and pieces, as stories do in small places. People spoke of how she had stood in front of the magistrate, how she had named the children and described their breath, their weight, their habits, as though they were her own blood. Some were moved, others remained unconvinced. But the tone had changed. She was no longer only the barren woman on the hill. She had become something else. Still strange, still outside the lines of what was expected, but perhaps not altogether wrong. It was Reverend Hanley who first came to her door. He arrived one Sunday after services, hat in hand, his cheeks flushed from the sun and a long hesitation. He apologized for not coming sooner, said he meant to offer help, but hadn't known how to approach. Mara did not ask him why he came now. She simply nodded and invited him in. He held Ruth while Mara changed Elias' diaper, and when the child clutched his collar with a sticky hand and laughed, the Reverend's expression changed from politeness to something near reverence. "They know you," he said softly, "as theirs." Mara didn't answer. She didn't need to. After that, the trickle began. Clara returned, bringing goat's milk when Mara's supply ran low. Two young girls from the schoolhouse offered to help in the garden during their summer break, their mother watching from the lane with folded arms and cautious eyes. Bread appeared on her porch some mornings, wrapped in cloth and tied with twine. A bag of donated baby clothes showed up without a note, tucked inside a crate beside the chicken feed. No one spoke of these things directly. The village had its pride, but the gestures came all the same, slowly closing the distance that had kept Mara apart for so long. Still, she waited. The magistrate's word haunted her. Asterisk pending further investigation. Asterisk, she imagined court clerks in distant offices, rifling through files, searching for names, tracing bloodlines. She imagined men with clipboards inspecting her home, measuring her worth in columns and checkboxes. Every time a stranger came up her path, her heart stuttered. She cleaned constantly, not from vanity, but from an old fear that anything out of place could be used to justify removal. She watched the twins like someone counting the days of fragile truce, memorizing the shape of their every gesture, as to try and etch them permanently into her mind in case they were ever taken. And then, one humid afternoon in July, Clara returned with news that carried the weight of a bell tolling. The birth mother had been identified. Mara sat down hard in the kitchen chair, Ruth in her lap, Elias on the floor beside her with a wooden spoon in his mouth. She did not speak at first. Clara waited, her hands knotted in her lap, her breath slow and deliberate. "She's not coming," Clara said eventually. "She won't fight. She's already signed the relinquishment papers." Mara stared at her, heart pounding in her ears. "She's young, from 2 towns over, poor, alone. She had the twins through a surrogacy arrangement gone wrong. Long story, complicated, with no real legal grounding. The intended parents backed out. She panicked. She left them where she thought someone kind might find them." Clara looked up, her voice tightening. "She knew your name. Said she'd heard stories about the woman on the hill who had no children, but who always left a jar of honey on the church steps at harvest." Mara could not speak for a long time. She looked down at Ruth, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder, lips parted, breath deep and steady. Then she reached across the table, took Clara's hand, and said only, "Thank you." But it was not over yet. The petition from the Hargroves remained open, though the mother had relinquished her rights, though the children had never known another home, though Mara had now months of proof that love had been lived and given and returned. The law still required its own order of operation. She was assigned a caseworker from the district office, a woman named Miss Leeds, tall, trim, precise, with a clipboard and a narrow smile. She visited weekly, each time asking the same questions with minor variations. What time did the children wake? What was their feeding schedule? Had Mara considered preschool when the time came? Did she understand the long-term financial obligations of guardianship? At first, Mara answered with gentle patience. But by the fourth visit, she allowed herself small notes of steel in her voice, not out of defiance, but out of weariness. "I have raised goats and tomatoes and grief for years," she said once. "None of them prepare you for children. But I'm learning, and I will keep learning." Miss Leeds never showed disapproval, but she never showed warmth either. She took notes, she nodded, and she left without offering reassurance. And then one morning, the Hargroves withdrew their petition. There was no explanation, no letter, just a legal notice mailed from their attorney's office, stating that they no longer wished to pursue the matter. Clara heard whispers. There had been pressure from the court to prove intent, stability, continuity. Someone had uncovered their hesitation. The fact that they had never visited the twins, never once asked to meet them. Their story had unraveled slowly. The way a poorly tied ribbon comes undone at the first strong wind, whether from shame or fear of public scrutiny, or simply the realization that these children were not theirs to claim, they stepped back. Mara received the news not with joy, but with a quiet, all-encompassing release. That night, she held the twins in the rocking chair beneath the nursery window and whispered, "We're staying." She repeated it again and again, not to convince them, but to convince herself that the weight she had carried for months was finally loosening. The walls did not echo anymore. The silence was not tense. It was full. The following week, Miss Leeds returned with a new tone in her voice. The case would be closed soon. Papers would be drawn up. Final guardianship granted. There would be more forms, of course, more waiting, but barring any unforeseen complication, Mara Ellery would soon be their mother. Legal, recognized, no longer provisional. Miss Leeds even smiled. The first real one Mara had seen, though it faded quickly. "They'll need a last name for the records," she said. "Yours, I presume?" Mara nodded. "Mine." That night, the valley was quiet under the weight of dusk. Mara stepped outside barefoot, with Ruth in one arm and Elias in the other, and stood beneath the apple trees. The branches were heavy again, this time with fruit almost ready for harvest. She remembered the winter snow, the silence, the note trembling in her hands. And now, standing in the same soil, her children's breath against her skin, she felt the truth settle fully into her bones. The world had tried to decide what love should look like, how it should be signed and sealed. But love had come to her through the back door, wrapped in rags and hope, and she had answered it with arms open wide. That would be the story they would grow up knowing. Not one of being chosen by accident or accepted with pity, but of being claimed completely without condition. No bloodline had bound them. No institution had ordained them. But they were hers, in name, in heart, in the quiet unfolding of every day that came after. The seasons rolled forward in their quiet, unstoppable way, and as the years unfolded, the house on the hill transformed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a slow patience that real change demands. The air no longer held the brittle hush of uncertainty. The walls, once etched with the dust of loneliness, now bore the scuffs of small feet and the echoes of laughter that traveled down hallways like wind through a field. The farmhouse, which had once felt too large for a single woman and too quiet for her thoughts, now pulsed with rhythm and noise and life. Ruth and Elias grew as all children do. Quickly, unevenly, in bursts that startled Mara in the quiet moments when she saw their limbs stretch longer overnight. Their minds leaped from question to insight. Their faces bloomed with the subtleties of their own becoming. There were growing pains, of course. Elias was the first to walk, then run, then fall with the force of a child who did not yet know his own momentum. He collected bruises like trophies and asked endless questions about the stars, about where the wind went when it left the trees, about why the goats made that particular sound when they were bored. Ruth, quieter in motion but not in thought, watched everything. She learned to read by candlelight beside Mara at the kitchen table, mouthing the words first, then speaking them aloud with a confidence that surprised them both. She spoke little to strangers, but to Mara she told everything, Her dreams, her fears, her theories about how the robins painted on the nursery wall must come alive when the lights went out. The rhythm of their life became a comfort. Mornings began with the clatter of bowls and the hum of the stove warming milk. There were chores, of course. Mara insisted on them not because she needed the help, but because she wanted the children to grow up with the feel of work in their hands. The knowledge that tending the land and feeding others was its own kind of quiet prayer. Elias gathered eggs with pride that made Mara smile, always gentle with the hens, always certain that each egg might be hiding a secret. Ruth helped in the garden, her small hands sifting through the dirt with reverence, as if the roots themselves whispered stories to her when no one was listening. People from the village began to visit, sometimes unannounced, sometimes bearing gifts, jam jars, secondhand books, carved toys left on the porch wrapped in brown paper. The twins became known, not as oddities or charity cases, but as fixtures in the fabric of the valley's slow, deliberate life. They played with the children of the village in the field behind the schoolhouse and were invited to birthday parties where the cake was dry and the games unfamiliar but joyful. There was a warmth building around the Ellery name that Mara had not sought but accepted with quiet gratitude. Not everyone understood their story, and some still whispered variations of the behind closed shutters, but for the most part, acceptance had come not in a blaze of glory, but in a slow, thawing ease. People stopped asking where the children had come from and began to ask how they were growing. Mara found herself changed in ways she had not anticipated. Her body, which had once moved through life with the stiff resilience of someone always bracing for disappointment, softened. Her eyes crinkled at the corners from laughing more than she used to. Her hands, still rough from work, now carried a tenderness born of nightly lullabies and early morning forehead kisses. She repaired the old swing in the front yard, the one that had hung crooked since before Thomas left, and now it swayed with purpose as Ruth and Elias took turns soaring into the sky, their feet kicked high, their shouts filling the air with that particular music only children can make. One summer, a carpenter came through town, a widower named Jonah, who was soft-spoken and patient, his voice low and steady like the current of the river that ran behind the village. He came to fix the church steeple after a storm, and when Mara brought a loaf of her sourdough to the repair crew, as she always did when anyone labored near her land, he thanked her with a gentle smile that stayed with her longer than she expected. Weeks later, he arrived at her door to return the bread basket, his hand brushing hers as he passed it to her, his eyes lingering not in longing but in understanding. He began a visit in slow, careful ways. He never pushed, never presumed. He carved a new cradle for the twins when they outgrew the old one, though by then they were already racing to the house like wild ponies, knocking into furniture and tumbling over one another in laughter. He repaired the sagging porch, replaced the broken shutter, mended the barn gate. He asked about nothing and helped with everything. Mara did not fall in love quickly or dramatically. She had learned, after all, that real things grow in silence and repetition, not in sudden declarations. But one day, when Elias cut his hand on a rusty nail and Jonah carried him inside with steady arms and quiet comfort, when Ruth cried not from pain but from seeing her brother bleed, and Jonah crouched to wipe her tears without a word, Mara felt something old and locked open within her. It was not romance in the storybook sense. It was belonging, forged slowly through the shared tending of what mattered. She allowed him to stay longer each visit. Eventually, he began to come without reason. He never asked to be a father to Ruth and Elias. He simply became something constant. They began to speak of him in the same breath as they spoke of home. Jonah says carrots grow sweeter after the frost, Ruth would say, and Elias, trailing behind with muddy hands, would nod and add, and you can tell storms coming by the way the birds go quiet. Mara never corrected them, never labeled it. She knew that love did not need names to be real. It only needed time and presence, and the willingness to keep showing up. They built a small bench beneath the apple trees, Jonah's hands shaping the wood, Mara sanding it smooth, the twins painting the legs with awkward, gleeful strokes. It became their place. They sat there in the evenings, watching the sun cast long shadows across the field, sometimes saying nothing at all. One evening, as autumn curled his way into the valley, Elias fell asleep with his head on Mara's lap and Ruth on Jonah's shoulder, and Mara looked over and whispered, "I never thought I'd have this." Jonah didn't look at her when he answered. He only said, "Neither did I. But here we are." The harvest came and went. Ruth and Elias started school, waving goodbye with arms too small for backpacks too big. The house grew quieter during the day, and Mara filled it with new things: music, letters to friends, preserves lining the shelves in neat rows. She and Jonah began to build furniture together. Small pieces at first, then a kitchen table wide enough to hold guests. She hosted dinners for the first time in her life, real ones, with napkins and candles and bread still warm from the oven. People came. They stayed. The house that once held only sorrow now held chairs pulled close together and rooms warmed by conversation. The air inside did not echo anymore. Years passed, not in a blur, but in full color. They were marked not by milestones, but by the slow, ordinary beauty of repetition. Birthdays, first snowfalls, scraped knees, songs hummed in a bath, stories told beneath blankets while wind shook the windows. Ruth began to write poems. Elias learned to build things with his hands. Mara taught them both how to listen to silence, how to knead dough until it breathed, how to be still and grateful and brave. She told them that love was not always loud. Sometimes it was just showing up every morning to feed the chickens. She had feared that she would never leave a mark on the world, that her life would pass in quiet labor and leave no trace. But as she stood one evening at the edge of the orchard, watching Jonah carry a ladder while Elias ran ahead, hearing Ruth laugh as she twirled beneath a canopy of gold leaves, Mara understood that legacy was not a monument. It was this: an orchard of trees planted in faith, a home built in pieces and patience, a family shaped not by blood but by the relentless, gentle act of choosing each other again and again. And for the first time, she let herself believe that everything she had lost had not been in vain. It had cleared the space for this life to bloom, this imperfect, miraculous, fiercely tender life. The night before they were set to leave, Mara stood alone in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a chipped porcelain mug, the one with the faded blue thistle painted near the rim. The one she had carried through every season of her life without ever truly noticing it had become a relic of her own endurance. Outside, the summer air was thick with the scent of hay and dust, the fields humming with the last insect of the day. The windows were open and the curtains breathed in and out with the rhythm of the wind, the same wind that had once carried the cry of two abandoned children to her doorstep, the same wind that now whispered of an ending she had spent years preparing for without knowing it. Upstairs, the rooms were still, packed boxes lined neatly against the walls, each one labeled in Ruth's careful handwriting. College dormitory essentials, Elias had called them, as if naming it made it ordinary, manageable. But nothing about this felt ordinary. Nothing about letting go ever had. The house was not empty, not yet, but it had taken on a hush of departure, the kind of quiet that comes when laughter has been folded into suitcases and footsteps are beginning to carry the weight of goodbye. The hallway, once cluttered with toys and school books, now stood clean and spare, and Mara found herself walking its length more than once each day, tracing her fingers along the walls, remembering the years marked by growth spurts and pencil lines on the doorframe. Ruth's books had been donated to the town library, except the one she could not part with, which now sat boxed and taped, ready for a new bookshelf in a room Mara had never seen. Elias had dismantled the swing again, this time not because it was broken, but because he insisted he would rebuild one in the trees outside his new apartment. "Every home needs a swing," he said, and Mara had nodded, knowing he meant more than he said. They had become people, fully formed, independent, shaped by 1,000 small choices and moments that had passed too quickly for her to hold on to. Ruth had grown tall and serious, but with a soft defiance that reminded Mara the first time she had held her in the firelight and seen something fierce in her eyes even then. She wrote with a quiet intensity, kept journals she never let anyone read, and spoke her mind in the fewest words possible. Elias, still prone to sudden laughter and reckless optimism, had become strong in ways Mara had not anticipated. Physically, yes, with hands capable of building and fixing, but also emotionally, with a depth of empathy that sometimes startled her, a capacity for kindness that came without effort or explanation. They had grown up on her land, in her arms, under her roof. But now they were growing past her, stretching into the world with a hunger she could not deny. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in the old rocking chair by the hearth, a blanket draped over her knees, the house dim and warm. She thought of the first winter, of the sound of cry in the dark and the weight of two unknown lives against her chest. She thought of courtrooms and cold stares and the way her voice had shaken when she stood before the magistrate and claimed them without permission. She thought of the nursery, the robins on the wallpaper, the cradle her father had carved in how, for years, it had sat empty like a wound no one would touch. And then she thought of the days after, the days filled with milk and song and the slow bloom of belonging, of how the house had filled with mess and meaning, of how she had become someone she never expected to be, not just a guardian or a caregiver, but mother in the deepest, truest sense. She did not cry. The tears had come earlier, in fragments throughout the summer, when she helped Ruth pick out bed sheets, when Elias bought a second-hand toolbox and showed her how he had etched his initials into the handle, when she found a note tucked into the kitchen drawer from Ruth, written in pencil on a scrap of envelope. "Thank you for choosing us." Instead, she let the stillness wrap around her like a shawl, not heavy, not bitter, just full of everything they had shared, everything she had endured, everything she had built with her hands and her will and her quiet, relentless love. Dawn came slowly, casting pale gold across the floorboards, and by the time the sun touched the porch steps, the house was awake. The final bags were loaded into the car. Jonah stood in the yard, his hands on his hips, watching Elias tie down the last box. He didn't speak much, never had, but the way he stood close, the way he laid a hand on Elias's shoulder when the job was done, said everything Mara could not. Ruth stood at the edge of the garden, her eyes scanning the field one last time, the notebook she always carried tucked beneath her arm. She walked the path to the orchard without a word, bent to pick a fallen apple, turned it over in her hand, then placed it back gently on the ground. Mara watched her from the window, heart tight, knowing that her daughter was saying goodbye in her own way, writing a memory not on paper, but into the rhythm of her footsteps, the press of her heel into the soil. When the moment came, it was not dramatic. There were no wails, no long embraces drawn out for the sake of sentiment. They each hugged her, Ruth first, quick but fierce, the whisper of "I love you" barely audible but searing in its weight. Elias next, who held on longer, who smelled like pine and sawdust, who said, "I'll call every Sunday," and meant it. Then they were gone, the car rolling down the lane, disappearing around the bend where the sun always struck the gravel just right in mornings. Mara stood on the porch long after the dust had settled, her hand on the post Jonah had replaced years ago, the wood warm beneath her palm. The house felt still in a new way, not hollow, not abandoned, just quiet, like a breath drawn in and held. She went inside, walked from room to room, touching objects without needing to move them. In the kitchen, the tea kettle still sat on the stove, the table still held crumbs from her breakfast, the chairs still pulled slightly out from where they had last sat. She left them as they were. She wanted the echo of their presence to linger just a while longer. In the weeks that followed, she adjusted. The days stretched differently now, slow but not empty. Jonah came and went, sometimes bringing with a plane, sometimes bringing silence. They ate dinner together most evenings, not as an arrangement, not even as a routine, but as a way of marking time with something warm. Mara took on small projects, patching the fence, painting the nursery walls a new color, one that no longer held memory but possibility. She started writing letters to Ruth and Elias, even though they called often, even though she knew she'd see them at holidays. The letters weren't for them, not really. They were for herself, a way to keep speaking their names, a way to keep weaving her voice into the pattern of their new lives. Autumn arrived slowly, gold leaves drifting down one by one, and Mara found herself walking more often in the orchard, hands in her pockets, eyes tracing the sky. She noticed things she had once overlooked, the way the light hit the hill just before dusk, the way the birds moved together then apart, the way the ground, even after all these years, still felt like home under her boots. She did not feel old, though her hands had begun to ache more in the mornings, and her hair had surrendered fully to gray. She felt full, not because her life had been easy or because it had turned out the way she planned, but because it had deepened, it had grown, and it had given her a chance to give. Years later, Visitors would ask her about that winter, about the morning the twins arrived, and how she knew what to do. She would smile, press her lips together, and say, "I didn't know anything. I just opened the door." And that would be the truth. Love had not come to her in the form of certainty. It had come as a question, a cry, a bundle wrapped in fear and hope. And she had answered, not with promises, not with declarations, but with presence, with staying, with holding, with waking up every day and choosing to do it all again. When she died, decades later, it was Ruth who found the letter tucked in the drawer of her bedside table, the one Mara had written years before, the one that ended with, "You were not born for me, but you were born to me. Every day I had with you was a day I chose to live again. And that, my loves, is the story I leave you." Ruth read the letter aloud at the funeral, her voice steady. Elias beside her with his arm across her shoulder. They stood beneath the apple trees, the ones their mother had planted and nurtured, the ones they had climbed, fallen from, and returned to. The bench still stood. The robin still flew. And the house on the hill, that old farmhouse with its scuffed floors and patched shutters, stood as well, not as a monument, but as a testament to quiet beginnings, to mercy, to love that had no beginning and no end, only a door that had once been opened, and a woman who had stood there, arms outstretched, saying yes.